It is not that allegations were made, but that nearly 6 months later, the loudest question is no longer who said what, but what has actually moved. When KwaZulu-Natal Police Commissioner Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi first leveled his allegations against Police Minister Becky Seal's successor, Senzo Mchunu, the political temperature spiked instantly. Headlines burned hot, timelines flooded with certainty, and many people assumed consequences would follow at the same speed as the accusations. Yet half a year on, the story has slowed into something far more uncomfortable. A test of evidence, patience, and institutional gravity in a system that rarely moves at the pace of public outrage. In those early days, the allegations landed like a thunderclap. Mkhwanazi spoke with the authority of a man inside the system, not a distant commentator. His words carried weight because of who he was and where he stood. To many listeners, it sounded like a senior law enforcement officer pulling back the curtain on political interference, operational pressure, and blurred lines between policing and power. The shock was not only in the content but in the confidence. This was not framed as speculation. It was presented as lived experience, as something witnessed and endured from close range. The first 8 phases of the story unfolded fast, almost breathlessly. Within hours, the country was trying to digest the scale of what was being implied. Allegations of interference in police operations are not minor complaints in a constitutional democracy. They strike at the spine of the rule of law. Commentators quickly connected dots to South Africa's long history of politicized policing, where commands, transfers, and investigations have too often followed political convenience rather than evidence. In that atmosphere, Mkhwanazi's claims felt familiar, almost expected, which paradoxically made them even more powerful. Political parties moved quickly to position themselves. Some called for immediate investigations, others urged caution, and a few dismissed the claims as internal power struggles dressed up as whistleblowing. Civil society organizations demanded transparency, while legal analysts began asking a more sober question. What exactly had been alleged, and what proof had been placed on the table? That question, at the time, was drowned out by volume. Outrage speaks louder than documentation, especially in the opening act of a scandal. As the days passed, the narrative expanded. Supporters of Mkhwanazi framed him as a courageous officer risking his career to expose wrongdoing. Critics suggested ulterior motives, hinting at factional battles within the state or resistance to oversight. The minister, Mchunu, responded with firm denials, rejecting the allegations and emphasizing respect for due process. He did not counterattack aggressively, instead choosing a measured tone that some interpreted as confidence and others as strategic restraint. Behind the scenes, institutions began doing what they do best and worst at the same time, moving slowly. Complaints were referred, legal opinions were sought, and internal processes were triggered. To the public, this looked like stalling. To bureaucrats, it was procedure. This gap between perception and process became one of the defining features of the story's first phase. The louder the public demanded answers, the quieter the official machinery seemed to become. Media coverage entered its second gear. Instead of breaking news, analysis pieces began to appear. Journalists revisited the original statements, parsing language, identifying what was explicitly claimed versus what was implied. This was where the story subtly shifted. Some of the most explosive interpretations were revealed to be assumptions layered onto carefully worded remarks. That did not invalidate the allegations, but it did narrow them. The scope became clearer, and with clarity came complication. By the time weeks turned into months, the first 8 movements of the saga had left the public with more questions than conclusions. What had initially felt like a straightforward confrontation between a police commissioner and a minister was now entangled in legal thresholds, evidentiary standards, and institutional caution. The emotional certainty of the opening days began to fade, replaced by frustration. People wanted resolution, but the system was asking for proof. The next 8 developments unfolded more quietly, almost deliberately so. This was the phase where reality asserted itself over narrative. Investigative bodies did not issue dramatic press conferences. Instead, they requested documents, conducted interviews, and weighed whether the allegations met the criteria for formal action. This process, invisible by design, created a vacuum that speculation rushed to fill. Rumors circulated about internal reports and confidential briefings. Anonymous sources claimed progress, setbacks, or political pressure, often contradicting one another. In the absence of official updates, every silence was interpreted as evidence of something, whether cover-up or collapse. The story became a mirror, reflecting the audience's own expectations and distrust. Legal experts increasingly pointed out a crucial distinction that had been blurred from the start. Allegations, no matter how sincerely made, are not findings. For action to follow, there must be corroboration, documentary evidence, or testimony that can survive scrutiny. In this phase, some of Mkhwanazi's claims appeared harder to substantiate than initially assumed. Not because they were necessarily false, but because proving interference is notoriously difficult. Instructions are rarely written down. Pressure is often implied. Influence hides behind meetings, phone calls, and tone rather than explicit commands. Mchunu, for his part, maintained his stance. He continued to deny wrongdoing and emphasized cooperation with any lawful process. His supporters argued that the absence of concrete findings after several months spoke volumes. Critics countered that delay is a feature, not a bug, in politically sensitive investigations. Both sides could point to history to support their case. Within policing circles, the story took on a more nuanced meaning. Officers spoke, often privately, about the broader culture of power and expectation. Some suggested that what Mkhwanazi described was not unique, but part of an unspoken tension between political authority and operational independence. Others argued that elevating such experiences to the level of formal allegation requires a higher threshold, precisely because of the damage it can cause if unproven. Public interest began to wane, not because the issue was resolved, but because fatigue set in. Scandals compete for attention, and without fresh revelations, even serious allegations struggle to hold the spotlight. This did not mean the matter was closed. It meant it was moving into a phase that rarely satisfies audiences: slow, technical, and uncertain. 2 further turns in the story sharpened the stakes again. First, the question of accountability shifted subtly. Instead of focusing solely on whether Mchunu had done something wrong, attention turned to whether the system was capable of resolving such disputes transparently at all. Second, the personal cost became clearer. Mkhwanazi's position, credibility, and future within policing were now inseparable from the outcome. Whistleblowing, even when protected in theory, is never without consequence in practice. These moments forced a reframing. This was no longer just about one allegation against one minister. It had become a case study in how South Africa handles claims of political interference in security institutions. The absence of dramatic resolution was itself a finding of sorts, though not one that fits neatly into headlines. Point: the dominant emotion was ambiguity. What stands out almost 6 months later is not a clear verdict, but a series of unresolved tensions. Mkhwanazi's allegations have neither been decisively proven nor conclusively dismissed in the public domain. Mchunu remains in his role, asserting innocence, while the investigative processes continue largely out of sight, precisely because it resists closure. It reminds us that truth in complex systems is rarely immediate and rarely cinematic. Sometimes, the most honest assessment is that the jury is still out, not because no one is looking, but because the standard of proof demands patience. In that sense, the real shock may not be what was alleged, but how familiar the ending feels. A slow fade into process, where